Washington, D.C., January 17, 1961. 3 days before he leaves office, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sits down in front of a television camera and gives his farewell address to the American people. He does not spend it thanking supporters. He does not spend it on legacy. He spends it on a warning. Eisenhower was not a peace activist. He had commanded the Allied invasion of Normandy. He had spent 8 years as president, running the largest peacetime military the United States had ever built. He had authorized the CIA coups in Iran and Guatemala. He had expanded the American nuclear arsenal to numbers that would define the Cold War for the next 3 decades. He was, in every measurable sense, the country's most decorated living general and a lifelong Republican. And on live television that Tuesday night, the general looked into the camera and warned his own country that the defense apparatus he himself had built was becoming permanent and was slipping out of democratic control. He gave the thing a name that most Americans had never heard before: the military-industrial complex. In the councils of government, Eisenhower said that night, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. He said, quote, "The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." He warned that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. And he closed the passage with a single sentence that has been quoted for 6 decades, since only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals. He said it would persist. He was speaking in 1961. 64 years later, one question is worth asking. Was he right? That question is the spine of this video. Because Eisenhower's warning was not vague. It was specific. He listed precise things to watch for: an immense military establishment, a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions, unwarranted influence in the councils of government, public policy captured by a scientific technological elite, 5 specific prophecies delivered by a Republican war hero in his last public minutes as commander-in-chief. We are going to take those prophecies one by one and hold each one against the reality of the American war machine as it exists today. An $853 billion annual defense budget, larger than the economies of most nations on Earth. 6 consecutive failed audits at the Department of Defense, with 61% of the Pentagon's physical assets missing on paper. 5 private corporations that between them absorb roughly half of every American military dollar. A senator from Mississippi whose home state hosts a shipyard and who writes op-eds demanding more Navy ships. A secret CIA prison hidden in a Polish forest, paid for with $15 million in cash delivered in cardboard boxes. An Air Force base in the Nevada desert whose existence the federal government spent decades formally denying. And now, a Russian proposal to place a nuclear warhead permanently in orbit, banned by international treaty since 1967, and quietly back on the drawing board today. Ike did not predict all of it. Some of it he authorized himself while in office, and then watched from retirement as it grew into something far beyond what he had intended. He was, in a real sense, warning against a system he had helped build. But he predicted the shape. By the end of this video, one thing will be clear. Eisenhower's prophecy was not a general moral lament. It was a technical forecast. And in almost every particular, it came true. The uncomfortable question is what happens next. Because in the same speech, Ike also named the only thing on Earth that could stop the machine he was warning about: an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. That is us. This is the American war machine, tested against the general who saw it coming. To understand why Eisenhower's warning carried the weight it did, you have to understand who he was and where he had been standing for the previous 20 years. Dwight David Eisenhower was born in 1890 in a rented house in Denison, Texas. His family soon moved to Kansas, where he grew up in a small town called Abilene, in a modest home with 6 brothers. He was, by every account, an ordinary Midwestern boy. He went to West Point on a whim because it was free. For the next 30 years, Eisenhower was a career soldier, mostly overlooked. He served under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. He drafted memos during the interwar years about how the American economy would need to be mobilized in a major future conflict. He was, by his own admission, a middling officer for most of his career. Then the world blew up, and Eisenhower's whole life changed in a single decade. In 1942, he was sent to command the Allied invasion of North Africa. In 1943, he was placed in command of every Allied force in Europe. On June 6, 1944, he made the decision to launch the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 256,000 men, 5,000 ships, 12,000 aircraft, every one of them, in the end, waiting on Eisenhower to say a single word. He said it. D-Day happened. 11 months later, Nazi Germany surrendered. But the more important story, for our purposes, is not the war itself, is what Eisenhower watched build up behind the war. Because to fight and win the largest conflict in human history, the United States had to construct, from almost nothing, the largest industrial military apparatus any nation had ever assembled. Factories retooled from making cars to making tanks. Chemists reassigned to making explosives. Universities placed on retainer to design weapons. A cabinet-level office, the Office of Strategic Services, spun up to run global espionage. Millions of civilians on a payroll that was, in effect, one giant defense contract. Eisenhower saw all of it from the top. And he saw what happened next. He watched President Harry Truman try to dissolve the OSS in 1945, only to have Truman reconstituted as the Central Intelligence Agency 2 years later, under a legal mandate whose vague final phrase, other functions and duties, would go on to authorize 100 covert operations. He watched the National Security Council, created in that same 1947 law, become the shadow policy engine of the post-war presidency. He watched a classified document called NSC 68, drafted in 1950, quietly commit the United States to a permanently mobilized defense economy, one that would never again be scaled back to pre-war norms. By 1952, when Eisenhower was elected president, the machinery of American defense was no longer a wartime emergency measure. It was a permanent fixture of the federal government. The wartime budget had become the peacetime budget. Then he spent 8 years running that machine himself. He authorized the CIA overthrow of Iran's democratically elected government in 1953. He authorized the CIA overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected government in 1954. He signed off on the U-2 spy plane program, secretly developed in the Nevada desert. He presided over the largest nuclear buildup in American history, a program known internally as the New Look that shifted the U.S. arsenal from the thousands of warheads to the tens of thousands. He was, in short, an architect, not a passive observer. He had built the very thing he was about to warn against. And that is what makes his farewell speech so important. It is not a bystander's lament. It is a confession delivered by the man who had spent his life inside the room. He knew precisely what the machine looked like from the inside. He knew what it could do to the people who tried to control it. He knew what happened when a wartime industry decided it was going to stay in business. And in his last days in office, he decided to warn everyone else. Eisenhower's first specific prophecy was about scale. He warned that the country was building, in his exact words, an immense military establishment, larger than anything Americans had previously accepted as normal peacetime policy. That word, immense, is worth pausing on. At the time Eisenhower delivered his farewell address, the total American defense budget was approximately $47 billion, which, adjusted for inflation, is roughly $500 billion in today's money. That number, in 1961, was already the largest peacetime military expenditure in world history. Today, that budget is $853 billion a year. Not adjusted, actual dollars. More than 1.7 times what Eisenhower already thought was dangerously large. But raw budget numbers on their own are abstract. The clearer test of Eisenhower's prophecy is this. Physically, on the ground, around the world. How big is the American military establishment today, and where is it? The Department of Defense employs, in uniform and civilian roles, approximately 3.4 million people. By some measures, that makes it the single largest employer on the planet, bigger than Walmart, bigger than Amazon, bigger than the entire government of most nations. Those people are stationed at approximately 1,250 military installations. Approximately 800 of those installations are outside the United States, spread across more than 70 foreign countries. Consider a single one. Camp Humphreys in South Korea. It sits on roughly 3,500 acres, the physical size of a small American city, and is the largest overseas U.S. military installation on Earth. It houses roughly 42,000 American personnel and their families. It has its own American schools, its own American hospital, its own American supermarket stocked with groceries flown in from the United States. It has movie theaters, bowling alleys, and gyms, all built to feel exactly like the American town most of its residents left behind. Multiply that model by 800 bases in 70 countries. That is not a defensive posture. That is an empire of installations, larger by physical footprint than any empire in recorded history. The Roman Empire, at its peak, held roughly 50 permanent legionary bases outside Italy. The British Empire, at its Victorian height, held a couple hundred garrisons across its colonial possessions. The United States has 800. Eisenhower saw the beginning of this. In 1961, the United States already had a global network, bases in Germany, Japan, Korea, the Philippines. But he warned that it was still growing. And every subsequent decade proved him right. That immensity has a cost, and it is not only financial. It shapes what American foreign policy is capable of considering. If you are a president, and 800 of your own bases are standing on foreign soil, you're structurally committed to defending them. You are structurally committed to the alliances that host them. You are structurally committed to the wars that erupt near them. The infrastructure decides the policy, not the other way around. That is a form of immense that Ike named, in the same passage of his 1961 speech, with a companion word, inescapable. He said, quote, "We can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense." Translation: the scale is now so large that it cannot be reduced, only maintained. If this video is starting to change how you look at American power, hit the like button now. It is the single simplest thing that pushes an investigation like this to more people who are asking the same questions. Because the second prophecy is where it gets uncomfortable. Ike did not just warn about the size of the military. He warned about who was going to profit from it. And in the very next sentence of his speech, he named that group precisely. He called it a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. And that is where the money starts moving. Eisenhower's second warning was about who would build the weapons, and about what it would mean in a democracy when weapon-making stopped being a temporary wartime job and became a permanent industry. His exact phrase was a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Vast. Permanent. Two words in 1961 that no previous American president would have described as a good thing. Before World War II, the United States built weapons the way it built anything else. A private company would win a contract during wartime, deliver the product, and then return to making cars or refrigerators or whatever it made in peacetime. The industry expanded when needed and shrank when the war ended. Eisenhower had watched that model die. By 1961, the same companies that had built B-17 bombers for the Second World War were still, 16 years after V-Day, permanent defense contractors. They had never returned to civilian production. They had built entire corporate cultures around a single customer, the U.S. government, and they had every intention of keeping that customer forever. 64 years later, that industry is not just permanent. It is consolidated into 5 companies. Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, the Big Five. Between them, according to the Department of Defense's own reporting, these 5 corporations absorb approximately $466 billion of the annual American military budget, roughly 54% of every military dollar the country spends. The remaining 46% is split, in smaller pieces, among a long tail of subcontractors and smaller firms, most of whom exist mainly to feed parts up to the Big Five. 3 decades ago, there were 51 major defense prime contractors in the United States. Today there are 5. The other 46 were absorbed through mergers and acquisitions, one industry-wide consolidation that the Pentagon itself, in a public report, has warned makes the country increasingly reliant on a small number of contractors for critical defense capabilities. Translation: a monopoly problem. When a buyer has no alternative and a seller has no competition, prices behave in one direction only. Consider the FIM-92 Stinger, a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. In the late 1980s, the U.S. government paid approximately $25,000 per Stinger. Today it pays close to $500,000 for the same missile. A 16-fold increase in a couple of decades. The Consumer Price Index over the same period went up by roughly a factor of 2.5. That is not inflation. That is what a captive customer looks like. Or consider the more famous case, documented publicly by the Department of Defense Inspector General. A single ball bearing, a small mechanical component that the Pentagon was purchasing from Boeing for $3,357 per unit. The same part existed in a Pentagon warehouse, cataloged, and priced at $15.42. Same part, 200 times the price. When Pentagon investigators do get around to auditing contractor books, they routinely find profit margins in the range of 40 to 50%. In any competitive industry, margins that high would attract new entrants and drive prices down. In defense, they do not, because there are no new entrants. The 5 companies that survive the consolidation carry every barrier to entry with them. Cleared engineers, cleared facilities, cleared subcontractors, a regulatory environment that took decades to master, a revolving door with the exact customers they sell to. The result is a permanent industry, at a permanent scale, at permanent premium prices. And it is subsidized quietly by 6 consecutive failed audits at the Department of Defense. The auditors, brought in every year to trace where the money went, keep filing the same finding. They cannot locate 61% of the department's physical assets. 6 years in a row. 61% missing. That is not a small accounting problem. It is a structural symptom of Eisenhower's second prophecy, an industry so vast and so permanent that even the customer paying the bills has lost track of what it owns. And so what do the 5 companies do with the profits? They pay their executives. And they pay Congress, which is the third prophecy. Eisenhower's third specific warning was the most politically dangerous one. He said, quote, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." Unsought. That is an important word. Ike was not saying that generals and defense CEOs would consciously plot to corrupt Congress. He was saying that even without a plot, even without villains, the sheer scale of the money would warp the political process. 64 years later, that warping has a documented paper trail. Start with a single number. In one recent year, according to public reporting on federal disclosure filings, top defense corporations hired 672 former Pentagon employees. Not over a career. In 1 year. As lobbyists, board members, and executives. 672. Every one of them left a job where they were regulating the industry and took a job where they were selling to it, bringing with them personal relationships with every acquisitions officer and every committee staffer they had ever worked with. The pattern has a name, the revolving door. Consider the case of General James Mattis. Mattis served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 4 decades, retired as a 4-star general, and then joined the corporate board of the defense contractor General Dynamics. During his years on that board, he collected a corporate salary and stock options. Then, in 2017, he left the board to be appointed Secretary of Defense under President Donald Trump, the position that oversees the exact company he had just left. When he resigned from that job in 2019, he returned again to the board of General Dynamics. Mattis is a well-known case. He is not an unusual one. The revolving door is not merely metaphorical. It is geographic. There is a neighborhood of Arlington, Virginia, called Pentagon City, sitting physically across a highway from the actual Pentagon. That neighborhood is where most of the Big 5 contractors keep their Washington offices, staffed almost entirely with former Pentagon officials, former uniformed officers, and former congressional staff. But the deepest layer of Eisenhower's third prophecy is not the revolving door. It is what analysts call political engineering. The Big 5 have deliberately distributed their production facilities across as many congressional districts as possible. An F-35 fighter jet has components manufactured in over 40 U.S. states. A single Virginia-class submarine draws parts from over 30 states. This is not efficient. Is not accidental either. If you are the CEO of Lockheed Martin and you want to make sure your F-35 program is never canceled, you do not lobby one senator. You lobby all 100 by putting a factory in as many of their states as possible. Every canceled program becomes a threatened factory. Every threatened factory becomes threatened jobs. Every threatened job becomes an unforgivable vote. Consider Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi. Wicker sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, one of the most powerful defense committees in the U.S. Congress. He publicly demands that the Navy build more ships. He has written op-eds in the New York Times to that effect. Look at his home state. The single largest employer in Mississippi is a naval shipyard operated by the defense contractor Huntington Ingalls. Every additional Navy ship Wicker helps fund is, effectively, more paychecks for his own constituents. That is not corruption in the criminal sense. Wicker is not taking bribes. It is exactly what Eisenhower described, influence that is unsought as well as sought. Structural. Baked in. Impossible to remove without dismantling the industry itself. Multiply the Wicker case by every congressional district in the country that hosts a defense factory. What you get is a Congress whose electoral incentives point in only one direction. The budget goes up, not because the threat requires it, because the districts require it. Eisenhower predicted that. In the same passage, he predicted its consequence. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We have watched it persist for 6 decades. And in the next chapter of this video, we get to the disastrous part. Because Ike did not just predict influence, he predicted power. And when the American war machine translated that influence into raw operational power, it did things that even Eisenhower, architect of 2 CIA coups himself, did not fully anticipate. If you want to see how far that power actually went, subscribe now. This is where the story stops being about money. Eisenhower's 4th prophecy is the most uncomfortable one to place next to his own record. Because Ike said, quote, "The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist," and by 1961, he had personally authorized some of the earliest examples of exactly that. In 1953, Eisenhower approved Operation Ajax, a CIA and MI6 covert action that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, largely because Mossadegh had nationalized the Iranian oil industry. The Shah was reinstated. The CIA declared it a triumph. In 1954, Eisenhower approved Operation PB Success, a CIA covert action that overthrew the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, largely because Arbenz had proposed land reforms that would have affected the American company United Fruit. The CIA declared it a triumph. 2 elected governments gone in 18 months. 2 long-lasting authoritarian aftermaths in both countries. Eisenhower had personally signed off on the tools that would define American covert power for the next 7 years. He knew, better than almost anyone, what those tools could do, and what happened when there was no one to stop them. Then came the successors. In April 1961, 3 months after Ike's farewell speech, his successor John F. Kennedy inherited an existing CIA plan called Operation Zapata. 1,500 Cuban exiles, trained by the agency in Guatemala, would land at a beach called Playa Girón and try to overthrow Fidel Castro. It failed in 3 days. The Bay of Pigs became the first major public disaster of the CIA's covert action era. Then came Operation Mongoose. Hundreds of CIA officers assigned full-time to killing Fidel Castro through means that ranged from poison pills to mafia contractors. Then came a document, dated March 13, 1962. Placed on the desk of the Secretary of Defense, drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, addressed to the President. It proposed a cover and deception plan, a series of false flag attacks on American targets designed to be blamed on Cuba to manufacture a justification for a full-scale U.S. military invasion of the island. The plan proposed detonating plastic explosives in American cities, faking terror attacks on Cuban refugee boats, blowing up an American Navy ship, faking the shoot-down of a civilian airliner, all to produce, in the document's own language, a helpful wave of national indignation. It had a name, Operation Northwoods. Kennedy refused to sign it, but it was on official Pentagon letterhead from the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military. One signature was all it needed, 15 months after Eisenhower's farewell speech. Fast forward 4 decades to September 11, 2001. 6 days after the attacks on New York and the Pentagon, President George W. Bush signed a classified memo giving the CIA broad new authority to capture and detain suspected terrorists anywhere on Earth, with a critical addition. The captured prisoners could be interrogated using methods that would be illegal on American soil. They just had to be interrogated somewhere else. The CIA moved fast. It built a network. The first secret prison was set up inside an old American military base in Thailand. The first prisoner, a Palestinian named Abu Zubaydah, was cabled about in language that has since been declassified. The CIA officers on site asked their headquarters for confirmation that Zubaydah would remain, quote, in isolation and incommunicado for the remainder of his life. Washington sent the confirmation back. When Thai officials grew nervous, the CIA moved him. A chartered Gulfstream flew him through the United Arab Emirates, filed a fake flight plan through Austria, and actually landed at a small airport in rural Poland. A 20-minute drive from that airport, an old Polish military base in the woods had been rented from the Polish intelligence service for $15 million in cash, delivered in cardboard boxes. Then Romania, then Morocco, then Lithuania, in a barn that had once been a horse-riding club. Then 4 separate facilities in Afghanistan. Then floating black sites at sea. 54 countries in total were used to shuttle the flights of a program that Ike had helped design the legal architecture for and would almost certainly have refused to authorize. That is what disastrous rise of misplaced power looks like. Not a plot, a drift, Legal authority granted for one purpose, quietly expanded to cover the next. Every step, at the time, justified by the last emergency. Every step, in retrospect, further from what Ike had ever signed off on. Eisenhower saw the seed. Kennedy saw the first sprout. Bush watched the tree. There is one prophecy Eisenhower did not exactly make, and it is worth naming because it is where the modern American war machine has traveled the furthest from anything the 1961 speech anticipated. Ike warned about weapons manufacturers becoming a domestic political force. He did not fully anticipate what would happen when those same manufacturers, with the U.S. government's approval, began exporting their products as instruments of foreign policy. Today, the United States sells major weapon systems, jets, tanks, missiles, radar, helicopters, to 103 foreign governments. 103. Almost every country on Earth that Washington considers a friend. To understand this, you have to go further back than Eisenhower. Further back than the CIA. Back to a book published in 1934 in the shadow of the First World War that stunned readers on both sides of the Atlantic. It was called Merchants of Death. The book documented in exhaustive detail how a small circle of European and American businessmen had industrialized weapon production in the decades leading up to 1914, and how those businessmen had sold their products, without moral hesitation, to every side of every conflict they could find. Ira Maxim, whose machine gun could fire 666 rounds per minute, took his invention on the road, pitching it in France, Switzerland, Italy, Germany, Russia, and South Africa, wherever a government would buy. Basil Zaharoff, nicknamed the Super Salesman of Death, reportedly sold submarines to Greece, then walked into Turkey and warned the Ottomans that Greece now had submarines, then walked into Russia and warned Moscow that both sides now had them. 3 sales from one lie. Alfred Nobel, yes, that Nobel, patented dynamite, made a fortune from it, and endowed a peace prize in his own name to launder his conscience. By 1914, the industrial-scale killing machines these men had built were sitting in every European arsenal. Then Europe used them. World War I killed or wounded tens of millions of people. And in the aftermath, publics around the world came to a simple, unpleasant conclusion. Weapons should not be a free market. Selling industrial-scale killing to whoever could pay had helped push a continent into the worst catastrophe humanity had ever seen. That is the moment when governments took over the arms trade. But something more subtle happened after 1945. Instead of shutting the private arms industry down, Washington kept it and turned it into an instrument of American foreign policy. Weapons stopped being just a product. They became a currency that the U.S. government could use to purchase alliances, cooperation, stability, and access to strategic resources. Every sale today carries an implicit demand attached. Sometimes it is alliance, as with NATO members. Sometimes it is help against a shared rival, as with Ukraine confronting Russia. Sometimes it is access to oil or shipping lanes or semiconductors, as with the Gulf states or Taiwan or Egypt. Consider one case. Saudi Arabia. Under the Obama administration, the United States approved enormous weapons transfers to Riyadh with legal strings attached. The Saudis were prohibited from using American munitions to commit war crimes or attacks on civilians. Then Saudi Arabia entered a war in Yemen. And American munitions began appearing in the wreckage of Yemeni hospitals, weddings, and a school bus destroyed in Dayan in 2018. Independent investigators, including the open-source research group Bellingcat, traced the serial numbers. American parts. Every time. Congress attempted to pass a resolution cutting aid. President Trump vetoed it. President Biden briefly paused deliveries, then resumed them. Washington had discovered something uncomfortable. In the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, the leverage did not belong to the seller. It belonged to the buyer. Because Riyadh could always turn to Russia or China or Turkey, and Washington could not afford to let them go. The pattern repeats. American weapons in the Philippines, used against civilians in Duterte's drug war. American weapons in Turkey, transferred by Ankara to Syrian proxies, who then fired them at American-backed Kurdish rebels. American weapons in Afghanistan in the 1980s, handed to fighters who eventually fired them at American troops in the 2000s. The weapons never go away. The leverage never quite works. That is the export side of the machine, the piece Ike did not fully see, and which today dominates American foreign policy in almost every region on Earth. And now we get to the piece Ike did see coming, the piece he called in his 5th prophecy, the capture of public policy by a scientific technological elite. Eisenhower's 5th prophecy was, in some ways, the most modern. He said, quote, public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite. He was speaking in 1961, a year before the first American astronaut orbited the Earth, 4 years before the first commercial silicon chip, 9 years before the first ARPANET nodes connected. Ike was warning about a class of people whose scale and cultural power he could see forming, but could not yet name. 64 years later, that elite runs the frontier. Every year, the Department of Defense spends approximately $140 billion on research and development, a figure larger than the entire economy of Morocco. That money goes to national laboratories, to defense contractors, to universities on classified contracts, and to a growing constellation of private technology startups that consult almost exclusively for the Pentagon. Nearly every technology of daily civilian life, GPS, the internet itself, drones, voice recognition, even the computer mouse, was developed at least in part with Pentagon research money. What you use to navigate to a coffee shop was built to guide a cruise missile. What you use to check email began as a Cold War communications network hardened to survive a nuclear strike. The most visible symbol of this hidden elite sits in the desert of southern Nevada. Groom Lake, Area 51. The mythology surrounding it, alien bodies, crashed flying saucers, hidden extraterrestrial technology, is almost entirely false. But the base itself is real, and what it has actually been used for is more revealing than any UFO story. Area 51 was built by the CIA in the 1950s. It was where the agency secretly designed and tested the U-2 spy plane, capable of flying at 70,000 feet, high enough to photograph Soviet missile sites, high enough to see the curvature of the Earth. When Soviet defenses caught up and shot down U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers in 1960, the CIA returned to the same desert and built its successor, a Mach 3 aircraft, cruising at 2,100 miles per hour, orders of magnitude ahead of anything else flying at the time. Then the U.S. Air Force took over the base and used it to develop the first true stealth aircraft, planes shaped in strange, angular geometries designed to scatter enemy radar. The F-117 Nighthawk. Later, the B-2. Aircraft so radar invisible that they carried out missions in Operation Desert Storm before their targets even knew they were in the sky. Along the way, a strange side effect emerged. Every time the base tested a new aircraft, UFO sightings spiked across the American Southwest. The CIA's own internal history notes that in certain years, more than half of all U.S. UFO reports were, in fact, sightings of classified American aircraft. The agency did not correct the record. In some cases, according to former officials, the intelligence community actively fueled the UFO stories, treating them as, quote, a bonus, a distraction that helped keep classified programs classified. That is what a scientific technological elite looks like when it is unaccountable. It does not just build the future. It controls what the public is allowed to know about the future. And the frontier keeps moving. In 2019, Congress created the U.S. Space Force, the first new branch of the U.S. military in 70 years, and formally classified outer space as, quote, a war-fighting domain. Roughly 12,000 active satellites now orbit the Earth. A growing share of them are military. According to a Space Force general, low-level attacks in space, jamming, spoofing, cyber attacks on ground stations are already happening every day. A Chinese satellite named SJ-21 has publicly demonstrated the ability to grab a defunct satellite in orbit and tow it away. U.S. officials have described the capability as dogfighting in space. The old Cold War dreams are all returning. Rods from God, tungsten rods dropped from orbit at hypersonic speeds. Brilliant Pebbles, a constellation of orbital interceptors, rebranded under the Trump administration as the Golden Dome. And in 2024, U.S. intelligence publicly warned that Russia is developing a nuclear anti-satellite weapon designed to be based permanently in orbit, a direct violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. At the UN Security Council in April 2024, the United States proposed a resolution reaffirming that treaty. Russia vetoed it. Russia then proposed a wider treaty banning all weapons in space. The United States vetoed that. Every party claims to want a peaceful frontier. Nobody in practice will slow down. That is the fifth prophecy fulfilled. A scientific technological elite operating in classified labs and desert bases and orbital constellations, driving public policy toward a permanent race that no elected official has ever been given the option to stop. Eisenhower predicted it. He did not predict the specifics. He could not have. But the shape is his. There is one final passage in Eisenhower's farewell speech that gets quoted less often than the rest, and it is arguably the most important sentence he said that night. After warning about the immense military establishment, the permanent armaments industry, the unwarranted influence, the disastrous rise of misplaced power, and the capture of public policy by a scientific technological elite, after listing every prophecy, Ike named the single thing he believed could stop the machine. Quote, "Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals. Only. Not a president, not a Congress, not a court, not a general. An alert and knowledgeable citizenry. That is us." Was Ike right about the antidote? The historical record contains one clear moment when it worked. In 1975, a decade after Eisenhower died, a senator from Idaho named Frank Church opened the largest investigation into American intelligence in the country's history. 800 witnesses, 10,000 documents. For the first time, Americans learned, in publicly televised hearings, the full scope of what had been done in their name. They learned about MKUltra, the mind control experiments, dosing citizens with LSD without their consent. They learned about Ciogenti El Piaro, the FBI's campaign to disrupt Martin Luther King, Jr. and other civil rights leaders, including a bureau letter suggesting that King take his own life. They learned about Operation Mockingbird, up to 400 American journalists on the CIA payroll, embedded in American newsrooms. They learned about Operation Chaos, the CIA spying illegally on the American anti-war movement. They learned about the Phoenix program, which had killed, according to the later testimony of former CIA Director William Colby, approximately 20,000 people during the Vietnam War. The country was briefly alert and knowledgeable, and the machine was briefly leashed. New oversight committees were built. New laws were passed. A foreign intelligence surveillance court was created. For a moment, Eisenhower's antidote seemed to work. Then came September 11th, 2001, and the leash came off. The Patriot Act passed with almost no debate. The intelligence community expanded on a scale the country had never seen. 22 Capitol buildings worth of new office space, according to reporting by the Washington Post, springing up around Washington to house the new top-secret clearances. So many new programs, so oddly named, that no single official could track them. Every tool the Church Committee had tried to bury, mass surveillance, warrantless wiretapping, mind-shattering interrogation, came back, sometimes under the same names, sometimes under new ones. Edward Snowden, in 2013, revealed some of them. Most we still do not know about. The pattern that Eisenhower described, the machine reasserted. The citizens, distracted or afraid, stepped back, which is where we are today. $853 billion a year. 5 defense contractors collecting more than half of it. A Congress structurally unable to shrink the budget. A CIA still operating under a legal mandate written in 1947, whose vague final phrase, other functions and duties, has authorized every covert operation since. A base in the Nevada desert whose contents remain classified. A weapon in Russian orbit that could, at any moment, put the 1967 Outer Space Treaty in the past tense. Eisenhower saw it coming. He told us it was coming. He told us the only thing that could stop it. The question is whether we are still capable of being that thing. If this video changed how you look at American power, hit like, the algorithm decides who else sees this, and the like is the vote that pushes it forward. Subscribe if you want more investigations that test the promises modern power has made against the actual receipts. And in the comments, 3 questions. First, do you believe an alert and knowledgeable citizenry is still possible in a country of 340 million people, half of whom get their news from 6-second videos? Second, if Ike could see 2025, would he say the antidote had already failed, or that it had never really been tried? Third, where does the next church committee come from, and what has to happen to trigger it? The Kansas farm boy who became a 5-star general, who became president, who ran the machine and then warned against it, spent his last minutes in office trying to hand the country the tool that could save it. We are still holding that tool. We just have not been using it.